years, advances in cognitive psychology and neurology have led us to develop a greater understanding of how the brain works and how we think. There's been much interest in this in a number of fields, from education, psychology, intelligence, medicine, business, and even finance. We're going to talk about two things. Firstly, how we think the brain works and carries out the thinking functions. And secondly, the way in which Western scientific thought and inquiry has evolved over the years. Many people have observed that the brain organises thoughts in an interesting way. As far as we can understand it, the brain connects together pieces of information in schemata, which are activated by electrical impulses through the synapses. As we grow and learn, more and more of these pieces of information are connected together in complex patterns, allowing us to recall certain pieces of knowledge and understanding quickly and efficiently. We also believe that the two halves of the brain are activated in slightly different ways and are used for different parts of the thinking process. It is believed that the right side of the brain is generally dominant in creative thinking, allowing holistic and intuitive thoughts. The left side of the brain is believed to be dominant in more logical and analytical thinking. This is the side that is activated for functions like language and mathematics. That's the traditional thinking about the brain, although we should not be too hard and fast about these things, and our scientific understanding is evolving all the time. All of this leads to an awareness that there are different modes of thinking. Daniel Kahneman describes it as fast and slow thinking, or System 1 and System 2 thinking. Edward de Bono also introduced the concept of vertical and lateral thinking. Both mean broadly the same thing and deal with the same sorts of issues. Fast thinking is a throwback to our existence as animals in the wild. Here, the brain will always attempt to order what it sees into patterns and templates, so that it can make decisions and take actions with a minimum amount of thought and effort. Wherever it can, it will attempt to do that. If you were walking in the bush, for example, and a lion came out at you in an aggressive way, you would not stop and ponder what course of action to take. Your brain and your body would take over and act instinctively. It's what we sometimes call the fight or flight instinct. Similarly, when we are doing everyday things like driving the car, brushing our teeth in the morning, we're not really thinking deeply, we're just acting instinctively. Slow thinking, on the other hand, is where the brain realises it needs to work something out, or to think more logically and analytically about something. It can't just pull an answer out of a hat. Slow thinking also acts as a regulation mechanism, which gets more advanced as we grow older, whereby we will not always say or do the first thing that comes into our head, but regulate our thoughts and actions. At least some of us will, and some of us are better at it than others. That's all fine. But the problem is that we will sometimes not think deeply and critically enough about things when we ought to. Very often, our brains will be making all sorts of assumptions about things, without our even realising it. Our brains will also alter our perception of the world before us to fit patterns that it has established. There are a number of visual perception exercises, sometimes called Müller-Lyer illusions, which very effectively show how the brain can be tricked and perception can be altered based on its experience and knowledge of what it expects to see. If our brains are doing that with visual perception, how do we know they're not doing it in other situations also? What this means is that our brains will organise information into linear systems, and these can become called mental ruts, whereby we always approach certain issues and situations with a particular line of thinking. Overcoming mental ruts and thinking laterally, as de Bono described it, is sometimes difficult. This is essentially the challenge of creativity, and there are techniques to help you to do it. We will say more about those things a bit later. The second key issue to consider is how Western thinking has evolved. Going back to the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, a scientific method of thinking has developed over the centuries which has come to define Western scientific and academic inquiry. This is essentially a logical and rational way of thinking, which tests hypotheses with facts and evidence to form judgments. Think of a scientific experiment. It starts with a hypothesis, then an experiment is conducted to gather some data, and that data is interpreted to form a scientific theory. In analytical thinking, Western approaches tend to adopt the linear patterns of what are called inductive and deductive thinking. Inductive thinking starts with a piece of evidence or event, then moves forward into postulating what is likely to happen next, based on previous experience and knowledge. Deductive thinking takes a bit of information or evidence and works backwards to postulate how that evidence came about. Most basic police detective work is essentially based on deductive thinking. There is a body on the floor with some clues present, and the police have to piece together the story that led to the murder. Abductive thinking, where you work sideways and form theories based on ideas, is less common in Western thinking and is considered less robust. Some non-Western cultures are more alive to abductive thinking. The problem with inductive and deductive thinking is that they can be somewhat linear and can constrain creativity. As de Bono said, rather than dig the same hole deeper, why not go sideways and dig new holes in new places? Just because something happened a particular way in the past does not mean that it will happen that way again in the future. Western thought is not good at considering situations for which there is no evidence or understanding yet, which is why science and religion do not sit easily together in the West. This can lead to analytical problems when we are considering other peoples and other cultures. We can summarise these notions by observing that there are three main issue areas in human cognition, which can lead to analytical pitfalls and a poor creative performance. These are memory. The human brain is not good at short-term memory and can distort experiences to fit models and templates. Perception. The brain will sometimes alter perception to fit models and templates, and does not easily take to perception shifts. And finally, bias. Our set of experiences and knowledge will inevitably lead us to approach some problems with a degree of pre-existing bias in our thinking. None of these are necessarily bad or unnatural things. They are what it is to be human in essence. But good analysts and creative thinkers will be aware of these pitfalls and will take measures to mitigate their impact on judgment and decision making.